We can even make modifications in our if function if we want to have some more things than just checking a single condition. So we can use what's called nesting, and I think we've talked a little bit about it before in previous examples earlier in the class. But the idea of nesting is that we can place a function inside of another function. So in terms of a nested if function, this means that we can place an if function inside of other if functions. Now, if we're not careful, this can become pretty confusing. But we can say something like, if this is true, then we can do another if function inside of the value if true argument of the function. Or if something is false, we can put another if function inside of it. And we can keep putting if functions inside of if functions. But it's just a way of being able to add some more complexity for checking specific values. We even have some functions that resemble the and or operation. So if you remember the and or gates that we talked about before, we have functions in Excel that work the same way. And we can use this if we need to check multiple conditions at the same time. So we have the and function, which is equals and then we have these conditions, which here we call them logical 1, logical 2, and so forth, but they're all conditions. And this function just simply returns true if all the conditions are true, and this function returns false if at least one of the conditions is false. And then we have the or function, which is just equals or, and then we have all of our conditions separated with commas. But this works like our OR gate, where this will return true if at least one of the conditions inside of the parentheses is true, and it returns false if all the conditions are false.
Let's take a look at an example where we can use the and then the or functions, and also see how we can use nested if. So in this example, we have some employees, and they work at different stores, and they made so many sales, and we can see how long they've been employed. So maybe we want to give classification numbers based on certain criteria. So maybe in this case, we'll say that employees, we'll look at employees with that have worked for 7 years and their sales exceed 30,000. Let's just try that. So in this column, we're going to see what would happen with using and in this column, we're going to see what happens when we use or. So like in this example, we'll use the if function as well, and inside the condition we'll use the and function. So here we need to have our logical statements. So we'll have a couple conditions. So we're going to check here in this case that if an employee's been around for more than 7 years and the value their sales has exceeded 30,000, we'll give them a classification of 2. And if this is not true, then they get a classification of 1. So let's just try this out. So in this particular row, it's row 5. In the years employees in column D, so we're going to do D5. If that's greater than 7, so if the years employees is greater than 12, or greater than 7, sorry, and the sales, which would be C5 in this case, is greater than 30,000. So if that's true, okay, well, we'll fix that, don't worry. So if this is true, then we'll give them a classification of 2. Otherwise, we'll give them a classification of 1. So this and is going to return true if both of these are true. So if these are true, then we'll get a 2, otherwise we get a 1. So in this example right here, well, it should give me a 2 because the years employed is greater than 7 and the sales is greater than 30,000. So if I hit enter, sure enough, I get 2. Now let's copy this for all the other employees here and see what we get. So all these are 1 because either their years employed was less than 7, or well, in this case here it is 7, but it's either 7 or less, I should say. And the sales is less than 30,000. So as long as either one of them is false, then the whole thing is considered false. Okay, so we see in this case only 2 employees have actually been around for at least 7 years and made at least 30,000. Everyone else didn't do that. All right, so let's try or. So now we'll just say either one. So if they've done at least one of these, we'll give them a classification of 2 or a classification of 1 otherwise. So let's do equals if, and then or, it'd be good if I can type. So D5 greater than 7, and then C5 greater than 30,000. So give classification 2, otherwise classification 1. So this is saying if D5 is greater than 7, or it's greater than 30,000, then we'll give a classification of 2, otherwise we get a classification of 1. So obviously, if the AND part was true, then the OR part's going to be true, because if both were true, then at least one of them's true. So sure enough, that is going to be true here. So let's copy the rest of these and see what we get. We get a couple more 2's this time. So like in this case, we see that the employee's been around for at least 7 years. So that's good enough to give this job classification of 2. And then like here, it's been 7 years, but their sales exceed 30,000, so that's fine. So we can see here that as long as at least one of these two cases is true, then this is going to give me a 2. All right, so let's try combining these and come up with a nested if. So let's say something like this. If both are true, so if the employee's been around for at least 7 years and it's made more than 30,000, then they get a classification of 3. And if that's not true, then as long as either one of them is true, then we'll give them a classification of 2. And otherwise, if that's not even true, then we give a classification of 1. So here we're going to find that we're going to put an if function inside of an if function. So let's go ahead and type this out and see what we get. So do equals if. So our logical test here is going to be the and I'm just going to put this in a separate pair of parentheses to make it easier to understand. I think we can get away without it. So we'll do and. So if D5 is greater than 7 and C5 is greater than 30,000. So if that's true, then we want to give a classification of 3. Now if that's false, now we need to check to see if, well, is at least one of them true. So we'll do an or. And actually, I think this is where we need to put something in extra parentheses. Yeah. So we're going to put all this inside parentheses. So or D5 greater than 7 and C5 greater than 30,000. Oops, there we go. So if this is true, we'll give classification 2. Otherwise, we'll give a classification of 1. And the thing you gotta be very careful with this is when we put if statements inside of if statements. In fact, actually, this is not even true yet. I forgot an if. Whoops. Hold on. See. There we go. Yeah, so we still needed the if in there. Otherwise, it wouldn't work right. So if the or part is true, then we will output 2. Otherwise, we'll output 1. But what we got to be very careful with is as we put if functions inside of if functions, we have to be careful with the parentheses. And what's nice here about Excel is we color the open and closed parentheses, so we can see that we're still missing one closed parenthesis. But this should be the complete formula here, complete function. So we do an if statement and we check the and first. So if both of these are true, we're going to output 3. Now this whole thing right here is the value if false portion. So if this is not true, then we're going to check if either one of these is true. And if that's the case, then we'll print a 2. Otherwise, we'll print a 1. So sure enough, this is going to print 3 because we already know that both of them are true. So let's copy this down and see what we get for everything. So this gives me a 2 because at least one of these is 2. At least one of these is 2. We get a 1 here because we see that the employee has been around for less than 7 years and has made less than 30,000. So they're going to get a classification of 1. So we can see here that the 3 gives us the case where both are true. 2 gives us the case where at least one of the two conditions is true. And we get a 1 for the case where both of the conditions are false.